And something, just some context for, by the latest session, apologies to everyone for that. But I've actually had all my possessions stolen yesterday, so I've been resolving that issue.
Oh dear.
Lots of formalities to go through, which has been quite stressful the last couple of days.
Well, maybe we can help you with things if
some
you
people have been really helpful. Some people have yesterday.
Yeah.
So it's been very supportive environment.
Yeah, we should see if we can, if you need more help, we can organize something. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I won't remember your names, but I'm going to remember your projects. It's so interesting to hear all these scholar activists trying to do things, changing our institutions from within sometimes. So and from all different parts of the world, there's so much to learn from each other. So what I wanted to do today is maybe two things if we have time. One is to look at one of the issues of debate within decolonial feminism over how to think about the history of gender prior to the colonial inclusion and do a more focused look on the work of Rita Segato. Rita Segato is an anthropologist by training, also does theory, and she's written a lot that's mostly in Spanish. Very little of her work has been translated. So Maria Lugones is much more well-known. Oyeronke Oyewumi's work has been translated for a long time. That's much more known, very important work. And then Kiro Nzegwu, who also writes in English, is a little bit more well-known, although I think needs to be more well-known. Segato is less, and it's very interesting work, so I wanted to bring that to you so you would be aware of some of this work. So one of the questions that these folks are addressing is how to think about gender and gender roles prior to the conquest, prior to the development of European colonialism. And they take different views. Oyeronke Oyewumi is a Yoruban from Nigeria. She teaches in the United States. She's a friend of mine. She taught here at the decolonial school a few years ago. And she's a very interesting thinker. She sort of studies linguistics. She spent a year in Zimbabwe recently studying the work, the issue of naming, which is, because the names that people are choosing today are quite interesting. So she's trying to think about what's going on with that. So she wrote a book that was published a number of years ago called The Invention of Women, in which she was arguing that that European colonialism, when it came to the part of Africa that she was mostly studying, really brought gender up as a central signifying identity feature in a way that had not existed prior to colonialism. So if you read the book, sometimes she does sound like she's saying gender didn't exist, but she's also, I think, more, when she's, sort of parsing it more carefully, she's arguing that there are multiple aspects of our identities that are socially recognized and socially important and affect our status in society, and that age is more important in the Yoruba community than gender was, or it was prior to colonialism. So age is very important, as it is in some other cultures too. Respect for age. I'm beginning to feel the benefits of that now. So that's been her argument. And it got taken up, sometimes as an argument that gender didn't really exist before. But you can read her work. I recommend reading her work to see what she's arguing. She lives in New York and still teaches at State University of New York, Stony Brook. Maria Lugones, who probably many of you have heard of and read, perhaps, and we're going to read a little bit more. She, originally from Argentina, spent most of her adult life in the United States, but also an activist. And she has argued in a very influential essay that European colonialism created a gender binary system that made every individual have to conform themselves into these two categories, and that this was oppressive. So she's using Anibal Quijano who thinks about coloniality of power, and she develops it to think about coloniality of gender, and has taken a stronger position, I think, than Oyeronke on the creation of a gender system under European colonialism. Nkiru Nzegwu is also from Nigeria, but from a different ethnic group, the Igbo people. And she's a philosopher who also teaches in the United States. And her argument, she has a book called Family Matters, which is a really important book. And she has a chapter in that book called Structures of Equality in Mono and Dual Sex Systems. So she's looking at structures of equality in mono systems and also in dual sex systems. In other words, systems that have multiple gender spaces in the way that Asagato, we're going to see, talks about. So she makes more of a historical argument, looking at practices in Nigeria today, and tracing out their history. So what she shows in her historical work, building on other historians, is that there was a certain economic system that existed prior to colonial invasions that involved gender division of labor, but in which there were separate spheres and value and respect and of the importance of the work that women did. Agricultural work, tending animals and so forth. This is not unfamiliar to many of us. It's the lives of many of our forebears who engaged in women's work. My grandmother made all the clothes and grew the crops and tended the chickens. And you get a certain amount of status from that, right? Your work is vital to the family. But what happened with the colonial incursions in Nigeria, as Nkiru shows, is the displacement of people from their land and the transformation of men from overseers over their own land to forcing to go to cities to become wage workers for the colonists. So you had a displacement of men who, to survive, and this is still ongoing, this is not unchanged, but to survive, they had to leave their land, leave their areas in the country and go to the cities and become wage workers. So what happened to their wives? Their wives followed them. Their wives went with them. And their wives became dependent on them economically. Because in those days, 1800s, 1900s, women were not hired for wage work. Or if they were, it was like ridiculously underpaid or non-paid. So the dependence of women on men economically was something that colonialism created, colonialism produced, that had not existed previously. And of course, that changed the terms of power in the marriage. It changed the terms of identity and what identity meant and what identity was associated with. So it became more familiar in the European model for some classes, not all classes in Europe, but for the middle class model of the middle class wife who does not work for wages, does not tend the animals and grow the crops and make all the clothes, and is dependent on the husband. So I think one of the points that Nkira makes is that conceptions of gender followed from the change of practice, right? The change of lifestyle. What she also argues is that prior to this colonial transformation of the society, behavioral traits in her community were not gendered. Behavioral traits were not gendered. So there was a gender-based division of labor in terms of the kinds of activities that you engage in. But behavioral traits were not gendered and leadership traits were not gendered. So leadership ability was not seen as exclusive to one gender rather than another gender. So that also changed with colonialism. And she gives us a description of the dual sex system that existed prior to colonialism that has some similar features to what Sagato describes for us. There was interdependence prior to colonialism. There was cooperation. There was women's participation in decision-making. Women had a certain amount of control and a certain amount of power. So this is really important work, and it's historically based, like Sagato's. These are not just philosophers like me who read books. These are people who go out and find out stuff. And what's important about this is that today, part of how colonial ideas continue is people go to other countries or they see on their television screen representations of what's going on in other countries, and they think, oh, this is how it's always been, right? So they see the gender relations today. They see the gender violence today. They see various kinds of issues going on today, and they think, this is how it's always been, and that's why the West needs to intervene and explain to them how to have gender equality. So this is so wrong, right? It's historically, it's based on false histories. So I think the impulse, the drive to change our curriculum and to limit our curriculum in many countries, not just the global North, has an ideological effect because it's going to help these wrong ideas persist, because people will be ignorant and people are so ignorant in the United States about the history of Africa in particular. So that's Nkiro Nzegwu's argument. Now let's look at Sagato. So Sagato's, this is one paper that got translated by Pedro Monque, who was also a student at the City University of New York and a student that I worked with. Finally, we're getting Sagato's work. She's huge in Latin America, very influential and well-known there, not so much in North America. And she's making, in this essay that I included, she's making methodological points as well as specific arguments about how to think about gender prior to the colonial incursion and post the colonial incursion. So what does she say? What basically she's arguing is that colonialism did not invent patriarchy. There was a form of patriarchy before colonialism in the communities that she researches. She doesn't research all of them, but she looks both at the Andean regions of, which is the largest indigenous group, Quechua speakers, Aymara speakers in Latin America, but also at some Amazonian communities in Brazil, which are very different. But those are the two focus points that she does in her research. So she argues for this concept of low intensity patriarchy versus high intensity patriarchy. And what, the question that drives her work and that many people in Latin America are working on is how to understand the femicides that are in many parts of Latin America, how to understand where this came from. Is this a feature of the continuation of male misogyny that has always existed? Sagato argues no. We need to understand the femicides in the context of current conditions, which are complicated and have multiple causal elements, right? But that's what's driving her work, is how to think about and how to understand the femicides, which are getting worse, right? They're getting worse right now. So Sagato is looking also at the state and what role the state plays on coloniality and decolonization. And I want to say something that's not on the slide here about that, because I think her work is relevant in a larger domain than Latin America, because it is relevant to the idea that Western humanitarian organizations like the United Nations and NGOs, many NGOs, which is so much global feminism is operating today in NGOs that are privately funded and do really important work in many cases. But that these sort of externally funded, externally organized operations, some legal, some help, providers, need to come in from the outside to solve the problems that women are having in their own local conditions. So the idea that the conditions of sexism that women experience are internal in the local space, so you have to do this intervention into the local space. You have to limit the autonomy in the local space, limit the sovereignty in the local space in order to solve the problem of violence against women. Sagato is complicating that argument. In fact, she's arguing against that argument, but she's also complicating the argument. So what role can the state play? In some cases, she's saying the state can play a role, but it needs to play a role by supporting community sovereignty and community autonomy. Why is that the case? She thinks we need to figure out how to make use of the rights that the state affords us without fostering a dependence on the state. Why? Because the state, like the Brazilian state, if you imagine the Brazilian state is not going to support decolonization to the extent it needs to, right? It's not going to support communal autonomy of Amazonian peoples entirely over their own lands, which is a lot of land, right? because the state is implicated in corporate capitalism and capitalist funds. Politicians are funded by these funds. The state is implicated and organized in corporate capitalism. So the state is not going to, it doesn't have the interest to, in fact, it has enormous financial interest not to really support communal power of indigenous peoples to the extent that's needed. So what does it do? It uses the oppression of women and it uses the oppression of children to justify its interventions, right? Now, sometimes there is truly oppression of women, and there's truly oppression of children. But this is the wedge, this is the mechanism that is used over and over and over today in the world to legitimate unilateral military interventions, bombing campaigns, violence, regime changes, takeovers. Iran is an interesting case in recent times because in the last couple of years there's been a strong movement within Iran against the sort of coercion of covering. And we've seen, if you live in the West, you've seen these images because they circulate on television all over the place. Iranian women pursuing freedom, Iranian women pursuing individual rights to decide whether to cover, how to cover, like do you cover everything, do you cover part of your hair, do you not cover it all? There's a lot of different varieties there. And so the movement has been about having individual rights to decide whether to cover, how to cover on their own. That is very legible in the West, right? That concept of individual rights is very legible, it's very familiar, it's very understandable, and it seems very progressive. And it is progressive in many respects, of course. But many of us were worried about this from the beginning. I did this interview with Nassim Nourouzi, who's an important Iranian feminist theorist who lives in Montreal. And she was following this with some, care and writing about it. And she was sort of seeing the stages. What she argues is that there were stages of the movement. In the beginning, it was a genuinely autonomous, spontaneous movement within Iran. And then it got massive Western support, massive Western publicity. And that, and there was a worry there. She was worried about what that would do. And what has it done? I'm going to start crying. What it has done is that the bombing of Iran that just happened from Israel and the United States was argued to be, this is what the Iranian wants. This is what they want. This is good for them. It's going to lead to regime change. So the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of the nuclear energy production facilities they're using this movement of women against the coercive covering to legitimate unilateral military invasions from imperial countries and imperial supported countries like Israel. So what do we do here, right? What do we do in regard to this kind of issue? How do we think about this? I don't have a quick answer, but that's part of the issue, is we have to contextualize these movements and contextualize the reactions to these movements. Which social movements of liberation in various countries get taken up and which do not. Which do we never hear about? Which get very little play in the global press, right? So we need to understand this. This isn't to say that we should. So one of the things Sagato is looking at, and Nassim and other decolonial feminists is thinking about, what does this mean? This doesn't mean that we're going to be cultural relativists, right? Sagato is looking a lot at issues of relativism, because some people think that, well, if those from outside Iran cannot say anything, or outside of Islamic societies in general cannot say anything about the issue of covering, we're just going to be relativist about it. What they do is fine. What we do is fine. No judgment. And that's not what follows from this, Sagato argues. She does not think that relativism is the way forward out of this mess that we're in. But pluralism is. So she's going to argue for a kind of pluralism, which is what Serene Cotter also argues for. So what's the difference between pluralism and relativism? Relativism is you do you, I do me. I'm not going to judge. It doesn't matter what you do, right? There's no overarching analysis of women's oppression or overarching analysis of femicide or of sexism. With pluralism, you can still have a critique of sexism. This is what Cotter argues. You can still have a critique of sexism, but you have to recognize that there are plural ideas of liberation, plural ideas of a good society for all genders. And so there may be variations in that, and this is what we see certainly with indigenous communities. There may be variations of that, but we can still have some ideas of oppression, of the oppression of women. So what Sagato argues is that there were hierarchies based on gender and sex prior to colonialism in some indigenous communities. So there was a gender-based division of labor, and she doesn't think in all cases there was equal power. But there was some interesting kinds of cases. For example, I was going to use an example from the Haudenosaunee, which is the seat of the Iroquois Confederacy, which was a large amalgamation and confederation of different indigenous groups in what is now the United States, that inspired Thomas Jefferson's formulation of the United States. The Confederation of the Iroquois Confederacy was a confederation of different tribal groups that had their own autonomy, but also came together to mitigate conflict differences between them. This is considered today the oldest democracy in the world. It's been around, it's still around for 1,000 years. This confederation of different tribes in northern New York and some parts of Canada. And different tribes have different practices, but in general, there is a gender-based division of labor. But for the Haudenosaunee, the tribal leader is always a male and always chosen by the clan mothers. I like this idea. The clan mothers are grandmothers, the older women. So it is not one person, one vote. It's not a democracy as we might recognize a democracy in some other places. It is a decision that only the clan mothers participate in to decide who the male leader is going to be when they need a new male leader. What's the logic here? Who knows, who have seen the kids grow up? Who has an interest in the community as a whole, and who can't get in their own way, right? So you can see the logic of this, of the clan mothers being given this power to decide who the leader is going to be. So these kinds of systems we find in different indigenous communities. And, we may criticize them in certain ways. We may not want to be in those communities ourselves, but we can see that this is not necessarily the oppression of women in toto, right? We can see we can have a pluralist view that might be able to manage compatibility or collaboration across these differences, even though there are significant differences, but across these differences, because it's not so clear. The examples that Rita Segato gives are, I think, kind of funny. I can find them here. Where she talks about the village world, and she argues that she gives us several concepts that I think are important. One is the concept of the village world, which existed prior to colonialism and survived after colonial incursion, even though it was changed, right? So the village world continues to exist in many indigenous communities. And she says the village world kept on walking alongside the world intervened upon by colonial modernity. So it had to change, but it didn't completely disappear. And the village world she describes as a world in which a people that she defines as having a historical vector determines its own fate and has sovereignty. So the village world is, so a people she wants to define not in terms of culture. She doesn't like the word culture. A lot of anthropologists don't like the word culture right now because it implies an unchanging substantive set of ideas, right, that are unchanging. And that's not what she finds in her work. It's never unchanging. It's always changing because new stuff happens, right? The climate changes. The economic incursions change, and so cultures respond. So she doesn't want to use the word culture. I use the word culture all the time, but she doesn't want to use the word culture because in anthropology it has this legacy of the stable, unchanging. And I think in the general population it also sometimes has that connotation of an unchanging, substantive set of commitments and ideas that you don't want to support because they resist analysis or social criticism. So she wants to define a people as a historical vector. A people is a group that sees themselves as having a shared history. So she says sees themselves. So it's about their own understanding of themselves as having a shared history and a shared future, right? So they're they're moving through time rather than simply caught in this absolute space. And that's an important move for the way we think about indigenous groups, and especially in the academy. So it's moving through historical time, a people moving through historical time. And she describes what's going on in these societies. Not as the imposition of patriarchy where there was none, but as as a kind of low intensity patriarchy, which, and this view, she argues, critiques Eurocentric feminism as efficacious or appropriate to deal with problems of low intensity patriarchy. So she's arguing that the Eurocentric interventions into these communities is not going to be efficacious. But she also looks at what happens to men after the colonial intrusion and in current conditions. And this is a key part of the explanation of femicide. She talks about this on page 789 in the text that I sent. There's 3 issues involving men that she focuses on. And she says it's explanatory. First, there is an overinflation of men's importance within the community, given their role as intermediaries with the external world. So in many cases, men are the ones who work in the external world outside of the indigenous community. They learn the language, they do the commerce, and so they have privileged access within the community because they have that power. So that enhances the power of men inside the community because they operate as the intermediary. They must mediate relations with the white administration. So they're the ones that mediate relations with the white administration. Secondly, however, men under colonialism face emasculation and a loss of status when they venture outside of their community and confront the power of white administrators. So in the same vein as Nkira Nzegwu was talking about losing land and then becoming wage earners in the city, where they face racism, colonial ideas, exploitation, expropriation, and violence in some cases, right? This is what she calls emasculation and the loss of status. So they're facing that as well in this white world that they operate in. Third, there is an overexpansion of the public sphere occupied ancestrally by men and the community, as well as a dismantling and privatization of the domestic sphere. So what she's arguing there is that prior to the colonial incursion, you had this domestic space and this communal space that were equally powerful, or almost equally powerful. There was decision-making, there was protocols of hierarchy and status and decision-making within each sphere. Women dominated in the domestic sphere, men dominated in the other sphere. The other sphere dealt often with relations between tribes or between different groups. So you would have, how do you carry out a war? How do you keep a war from happening? How do you negotiate treaties? That kind of thing was done by primarily men in that other sphere. But there was this domestic sphere that also had power over decision making that was important for the group as a whole, and also over families and children and reproduction and food production, and could deal with male violence against women in a communal way, in a judicial way, in a collective way, right? So there would be intervention. If there was a man beating his wife, there was intervention. And it was not just random or spontaneous, it had certain practices of intervention that were respected by everybody in the community and were known about by everybody in the community. So you had practices to protect women. Those were dismantled entirely under colonialism. So that's the problem now. That doesn't explain femicide entirely, but that is a major problem. That has been disassembled. That system has been disassembled. So if we disassemble gender systems and we move indigenous communities, as Peru tried, in the early part of the 20th century, the indigenous should just think about themselves as individuals. They should understand themselves as individuals. This does not solve the problem because it keeps women captive in families without collective support, without collective communication, and without collective interdependence. Sagato sees that system prior to colonial incursion as a kind of low-intensity patriarchy, whereas now it's high-intensity patriarchy. So I want to see what you think about this at this point. We have a little time for questions to see if you have thoughts on it, and we'll probably have to talk about Serene Cotter tomorrow. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah.
But my question, and it started when we were talking about Iran, but I think it applies to a lot of this, is what do we do about diaspora? Because, for example, in the Iran example that you're using, being in LA, which is a huge Iranian expat population, I have witnessed how it's a lot of times Iranian American beating the drum for exactly what we're talking about in terms of the Western intervention or the kind of villainization, and obviously the Iranian regime is terrible. So it may be a product of colonization, but it's also terrible.
Yeah.
So my question is, I guess what I'm saying is that the way that it's framing, and I know that this is not an intention, but it's kind of like a West versus Indigenous thing. I think it's more complicated.
Yeah.
I think that we really need to account for how displacement and diaspora and has also produced a kind of a community of, in culture and in language and in appearance, maybe of the culture, but in terms of their political lens and understanding of the world, they're aligned with the colonizer or feel that they have to be in some way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was wondering.
Yeah. Well, I think we can use the rejection of that notion of stable culture, which is helpful, and see the culture is complex within, differentiated within, and changing. Also, diasporas, because I live in the United States, where the Latinos in Florida do not represent Latin America politically. I mean, there's a lot of variation, but the exiles who fled Cuba, there's differences in different generations, but also from Venezuela, also from some other parts of Latin America, they have politics that are not representative. So you can't take the diasporic Latino community and think they're representative of the people back in their home countries. It's a particular constituency, sometimes differentiated by class and by color or, features, but also differentiated politically, fleeing communism, right? So I think diaspora communities that support military interventions, there's not a motivation to understand that diaspora community is not representative of all Iranians. There's not a motivation in the mainstream white-dominated public press in the United States, I think, to really unpack what's going on here. And they may also feel worried about who are we to criticize these Iranians in LA, right? So, but you have to bring out the different voices, because there are always differences within the diaspora, different political voices, and show the debate. I don't know if anybody has other solutions to this. Go ahead.
Yes. This is what representative all Iranians have left.
Can you speak up a little bit?
So this is not representative of all Iranians have left Iran, but most Iranians that can go to the States or the UK will tend to be followers of Shah, who is just as aggressive, if not worse. And the problem is that often countries like Iran or any country that is being told otherwise by the West ends up putting its guard up. And by putting its guard up, it ends up taking away the tools that the nation offers as a way of emancipation of people that want certain change in society. So the more the West wants it, the more it becomes more expensive. I know of many Iranians that live within Iran, many Iranians are sympathetic to the government outside of Iran, and they have criticisms of in Iran. And they're like, it's a very complicated situation because the more white feminists in the West will say, you know, what about the hijab issue or the enforcement of the hijab issue? It makes the situation a lot more difficult for the indigenous people to kind of have indigenous tools. So even like, for example, in the UK, when you had the Muslim Council of Britain elect female leader, and she goes up to you for the first time in the interview, and one of the first questions they ask her is about female imams. Like, look, let's look into this. Because, you know, it's a moment to celebrate the fact that the Muslim Council representative of the largest Muslim body has put forward a indigenous-born Muslim female. Let's celebrate this moment. There are challenges within the Muslim community in Britain. We work with that. We can work towards a particular way and let the community deal with it. That's the first question that comes out of the interviewers now. And that's where the problem lies. The question of female imams or the Catholic Church is changing, etc. We look at Islam in China, for example, they found a solution to, maybe it's not the right solution, or I'm not advocating either way, but they found the indigenous solution to it by saying, you know what, we're going to have our own mosque. And a female-only mosque where females have leaders. But even some of the conservative scholars within Islam, like sort of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ahmed bin Hanbal, and then you've got Sufi mystics who was just Sufi, but at the same time who was very conservative in theology, Ibn Arabi, the Andalusian scholar, that there are no issues of females, imams leading prayer over both men and women.
Mm-hmm.
But those tools exist. The problem is that the moment you have outsiders prodding, all of those tools exist.
Yeah, that's great points. Leila Ahmed, who's written a lot on women in Islam, do you know her work? Leila Ahmed.
Okay.
Yeah, she has this wonderful autobiography of growing up in Egypt in gender-segregated religious practices in which women would come together when she was a child and behind a curtain, and they had their own Quran and were discussing it and interpreting it themselves. Many of the women did not read, so they didn't have literacy, but they engaged in discussion behind the curtain. And they had their own discussion, right? They were interpreting, they were like assessing, they were discussing without male intervention in that case. So sometimes the gender separation, like in sex-segregated schools in some cases, can enhance female agency, the capacity, the possibilities for female agency. So it's a complicated story. But I think the concept that we'll see tomorrow of justice enhancement that Cotter gives us will help to think about this justice enhancement rather than this, and pluralism, rather than a notion of what liberation will look like, whether or not and always measuring against this singular ideal of gender liberation. right? We need to have multiple, we need to understand that there's multiple possibilities of female liberation or improvement on today. Yes. Yes, and then you next.
Thank you. I also think it's important to recognize that there's an entire school of entire field of feminism, of Islamic feminism.
Mm-hmm.
So to have to even understand this through these Western thought processes is also a form of violence, right? There is an entire field of Muslim women and also feminist men, right? So feminism isn't for women. Feminism is for everyone. And Islam is a religion that has predated what we are even discussing. So to not include Islamic feminisms into a discussion even around Iran. In Morocco, they have women leading, right? So to minimize it also in these pockets of Iran or Saudi Arabia is also, I think, a form of violence around how we think about Islam, how we think about feminism, how we think about religion, and how we think about it from a Western perspective, right? There is an Eastern thought on Islam, and Islam is bigger than the Arab world or Iran. Right? It is everywhere. It is a quarter of the globe. So Islamic feminisms exist, and there are scholars who can educate us on the outside of trying to force Western mindsets into an Eastern. I just wanted to put that there because when we think of Iran, we also have to recognize how Iranian Americans were supporting Israel long before the bombing, right? We have to recognize how this movement inside Iran was now just co-opted by the bombing, and now people have to support the government that they don't like because they cannot support Israel, right? So Israel has created a problem for the feminists, for the local struggle.
That's right.
And we have Iranian Americans who are problematic in that struggle as well.
Although I don't think it's fair to say that it's only the problematic Iranian Americans who have the problem. Because, well, I totally agree with what you're saying, both of you are really excellent, but I do think that there is a contingent of women who have used whatever resources they have to leave after the Islamic State in Iran, and that they too, they have that more conflicted perspective. But I guess the only thing I want to say is that I really value everything you're saying. I'm having certain anxiety because it does feel like, again, there's a sort of like the West, and then there's some indigenous people. But actually, like a lot of those people who support the Shah, who then came to the United States, I don't think we would consider them indigenous just because they were born in Iran. Because indigeneity is something else. It's not urban imperial culture. And so like, she used the word caste. I gotta use the word caste. That really got under my skin. Because caste is not something that we can just say, oh, it was cool. It wasn't that bad until the British came. No, it was bad way before the British came. I have that idea where that term caste originates.
Yeah.
I think it's being misused by some So I feel like we do need to push back a little bit and be like, no, we need to be more critical of our own societies too. I totally agree that it's the role of the Muslim feminists to do that, not the role of the Western feminists to do that. It's just in this kind of classroom, that's not necessarily what happens, right?
Yeah. It's the local and the global, like criticizing the global, but also criticizing the local. I think that's right. Did you want to address that?
You know, I think the mention was very important around what Islamic women, feminist scholars to help us make sense. And one of them is my colleague, Sadia Shah. She's a scholar in Islam, feminist field.
How do you spell her last name?
Shaikh.
Okay.
And her recent work, the title is Sufi Narratives of Intimacy. Sufi Narratives of Intimacy, Ibn Arabi, and highly respected
Wonderful. Yeah, Aziza Al-Hibri is another one that I learned a lot from. She was a feminist philosopher in the United States who founded Hypatia, the Journal of Feminist Philosophy, and originally, and then she kind of left philosophy to go into theology to become an Islamic scholar, and she can go toe-to-toe on the text, which is what you need. So we'll have to continue this conversation tomorrow. I know some people didn't get their questions answered. We'll have more discussion. We'll have more time for discussion tomorrow. Today, I wanted to take the opportunity to hear from all of you and to find out what you're working on with each other. So we did that. Okay, so see you tomorrow. Same time, same place.